thank you for coming. I'm here with Tom Biolsi. Tom is a senior project manager and professional geologist with TRC, an environmental consulting corporation, and TRC is our consultants for our EPA Brownfields grant. So currently Tom is working with the town assessing the Ried Cleaners site, the Cook's Garage site, and also across the street here, the old quote-unquote Hong Kong buffet. We call it Carpenter's Variety, which some of you will take you back 10 or 20 years, I'm sure. So Tom will explain a little bit more about the details of Ried Cleaners, but really the purpose here is to inform you of the town's intent to apply for an EPA cleanup grant and to inform you what we now know about the Ried Cleaners site based on our assessment work. I just wanted to acknowledge, just for the record, thank you to the Berkshire Record for advertising the public notice and for doing a brief story about this last week, which helps us get the word out. So the Ried Cleaners site is about 1/3 of an acre, and it's outlined in red on the poster board that Tom has here, and we can send that out to you as well. It's about 1/3 of an acre at 218 Main Street. There's just one building left. That's the main building right on Main Street. It's got a footprint of about 3,400 square feet. It does have a basement of about the same size, so double that for the total volume. But the footprint's about 3,400 square feet. It was a dry cleaning business for about 60 years and closed in 2006, I think. Yep. The dry cleaning building was out back. It's not there anymore, and it was demolished in 2008. There were 4 underground tanks back there, 2 of which had fuel oil and 2 of which had dry cleaning fluid, which is known as PERC or PCE. It's actually tetrachloroethene, right? Is that right?
Yeah, tetrachloroethylene is the compound, which
it's a
commonly known as PERC.
It's a chlorinated solvent, PERC, used in dry cleaning. And those 2 tanks leaked into the soil. And so the soil back where those tanks were and where that dry cleaning building was is contaminated with that solvent. And Tom will tell you a little bit more about that. So, but just briefly, it's kind of the history of the site. The Ried family, to the extent they could, until they no longer really had the financial wherewithal, did try to deal with the contamination at that time. And Mass DEP also stepped in right around 2008 as well to deal with some of the kind of imminent hazards presented by that contamination. In 2015, the town also received a mass development grant to do some additional assessment work at the site. The town had been getting calls, and we're still getting calls and inquiries from the private sector about what's going on with this site. Can it be, can we buy it? Can we clean it up? Can we redevelop it? And so in 2015, we approached Mass Development and said, there's some commercial viability for the site. Will you help us further assess what's going on and position it for redevelopment so we know if you can give us more money for assessment, we can have a better idea of what's needed to clean this up. So we were able to work with TRC and do additional assessment then, and we did basically a phase 2, a preliminary phase 2 at the time. But more work was required to be done. So in 2017, we received another grant, this one from US EPA for brownfields assessment, and that's the one Tom is working on right now with us. Mm-hmm. And now that we've done quite a bit of work there, both inside the building and further drilling, groundwater drilling on the site and around the site, we have a better idea of what's needed to clean that up. So, as you know, the town is the owner of the property, and that doesn't mean we're liable for the contamination unless we utilize the property in some way. But we see that there are some benefits to the town taking the lead at this point and trying to clean it up. Social kind of benefits, removing the boarded up, dilapidated structure and increasing the kind of the look of that area and promoting redevelopment there. Obviously, health impacts if we can clean it up, that's great. And potential, economic and fiscal impacts if we can return it back to, a tax-paying use. So that's why we're here. That's what we hope to accomplish. And I'll let Tom talk a little bit about, the situation and
Sure.
how we can deal with it.
Okay.
Quick question, Chris. With the oil tanks were not leaking?
They did
Oil?
too.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, they did
Okay.
too. Yeah. Of the 4 tanks, apparently all 4 of them removed, all 4 of them had roughly 1/4-inch holes in them when they were taken out back in 2008. Around the same time when that building was demolished and they found the tanks, took the tanks out, found they were all leaked. As Chris mentioned, half of them had fuel oil, half of them had dry cleaning fluids in them. So as Chris mentioned, in 2008 is when kind of the environmental investigations started. So since 2008 up until the present, there's been a number of environmental investigations that have occurred on the property and surrounding properties, which has included collecting numerous soil samples, groundwater samples from monitoring wells that are installed. Meaning monitoring wells are installed is you just drill a hole in the ground, and instead of filling it back in with dirt, you put a PVC pipe in, and the bottom of it has thin little slots machined in it at evenly spaced intervals that allow groundwater to infiltrate in. And it has a metal cap on the top, similar that like if you see on the streets like a manhole cover, but this is a smaller diameter, to allow environmental consultants like us come there, take the cap off, stick a pump down in the bottom of the well, and extract the groundwater out and send it to a laboratory for analysis. So this figure here, all these symbols in different colors, in general, the ones that have this type of circular symbol, are all groundwater monitoring wells that are there to allow us, or environmental consultant, to go out and collect a water sample from it. So, over the years since 2008, there's been more and more groundwater wells been installed to evaluate the groundwater quality, and for a couple of different reasons, to see how it's changed over time, and also to delineate the extent of the contamination, trying to see how far the contaminated water has gotten. With chlorinated solvents, as Chris has mentioned, because it's one of the reasons why there's been so many environmental investigations and why more money is usually needed, chlorinated solvents is difficult to fully assess and to clean up just because of the nature of the contaminant. Chlorinated solvents are denser than water, so they don't float on the water surface. They're gravity driven. So they don't necessarily follow the direction of groundwater flow. There's usually 2 components, some that dissolves within the groundwater that will follow the groundwater flow direction. And another component, since it's denser to water, it will just keep going down until it reaches something that it can't get through. And the can't get through could be a variety of different things. It could be the bedrock surface, the rock. It could be a confining layer like clay that doesn't really let water or a contaminant penetrate it, or not as easily. And of course, the deeper you go, the more expensive equipment that's needed to get down deeper to get the contaminant, bring it back up, and send it to the laboratory. So it's just inherently more expensive and a little more difficult and time-consuming to complete projects like this. But this has been ongoing since 2008. So as you can see, there's been a number of assessment and monitoring points done at this point that we have much better understanding, obviously, than back when it was first discovered, when the tanks were taken out in 2008. So kind of bringing us to present day, what do we know? So as Chris mentioned, it may be a little difficult to see, but there's a black dashed outline here of where the former facility building used to exist. This is where they did the actual dry cleaning operations. This building that still stands here along Main Street was more for the retail operations. Where they did the actual cleaning of the clothes and garments was back here. And not surprisingly, from an environmental standpoint, that's where most of the contamination was and still is now. Well, we can, if you read some of the documents, if you read the word source area, that's kind of the source of contaminants. Some of the earlier investigations done by DEP, there were a variety of floor drains in the building when it existed. Typically floor drains in a building like that, that's where the contaminant was either released purposely or by accident down the floor drains. And so they did some sampling where the floor drains were, dug some test pits. Really what that means is taking like a backhoe or an excavator out there, digging where the floor drains were, taking some soil samples, and some of those samples were fairly contaminated with chlorinated solvents, the dry cleaning fluids. None of the soil from that area was taken off site at the time due to funding limitations. Disposing of chlorinated solvents can be very expensive. So the data were collected from what the contaminants are, what the concentrations were, and the soil was put back in place and then covered at the surface with clean sand. For those of you who may not know, this is a parking lot back here, but where the building used to be, in most, generally speaking, there isn't pavement there. It's partially covered with pavement, but it's kind of broken up. So the highest concentrations in soil from chlorinated solvents and some from petroleum are still located within this building footprint, generally speaking. These other colored polygons here, there's one in orange, a rectangular polygon, and a oval shape here, that's denoting areas of soil contamination. The inner one is where the highest contamination is in soil, and the purple line is lesser contaminants. Both are still above the state standards. This is kind of getting into, okay, so what are we going to do? How are we going to clean this site up? Now the soil contamination, what that has done, it has contaminated groundwater, hence the need for all the monitoring wells to evaluate the groundwater quality. Because chlorinated solvents is volatile, you can generally, things that are volatile you can generally smell. It has a propensity to potentially migrate its way into any enclosed structures. So anytime there's a chlorinated solvent release, one of the first things that environmental consultants look at and the state looks at is it getting into the indoor air at any nearby buildings? So some of the assessment not only has included soil and groundwater testing, it also has included indoor air testing and sub-slab soil vapor or soil gas testing. What that is underneath every building, typically normal construction practices are they install like a gravel layer before they pour the concrete. Well, the gravel layer has pore spaces that has air trapped in it. So we want to test the air that might be trapped underneath the building. That kind of tells us what is being contaminated from the ground. And then testing the indoor air is, all right, are there any contaminants in the ground that's coming into the indoor airspace? That's primary concern because that's where people occupy, not in the ground, they're in indoor air spaces. So indoor air had been tested in the vacant building back in, don't quote me on this, but back in 2010 timeframe. And then indoor air has been tested multiple times in the post office, and it's been tested in the bank and these two here, the 9 and 11 Rossiter Streets. The most recent testing that our company has done in these three buildings here, the bank, 9 and 11 Rossiter, the indoor air was below the state's threshold, meaning that there's no significant risk from indoor air from chlorinated solvents in those structures. The post office has their own environmental consultant. They're kind of assessing that on a kind of parallel track of what the town and what we're doing. And I believe the state had also tested the indoor air at the library, and that was also below the state's threshold values, meaning that there's no concern at this time for indoor air at the library either. So one of the primary mechanisms that we'll look at for cleaning up the site because the soil still remains here that's contaminated, it's believed that the soil could still be contributing to contaminating the groundwater, which in turn is going to present concerns for indoor air. So as part of the draft application that Chris handed out, part of the cleanup remedy is to get rid of that soil that's causing the contamination to groundwater. Getting rid of it, it's literally digging it up and hauling it off to a permitted facility that will take it. So the cleanup options that you will see in the document that Chris handed out, there's three different alternatives. One is the do nothing, the no action alternative. That may seem kind of silly, but it's required by the state and required by EPA, to document in writing that you do need, in fact, to do something. You need to evaluate, well, if we did nothing, is that going to achieve no significant risk? Can we close out this site if we just did nothing? The answer to that is no. Seems kind of obvious, but you need to go through that. So the other two alternatives that we looked at to clean up this was digging up the soil, a large-scale cleanup, meaning digging up soil within this purple outline area down to the water table, and the water table where groundwater is. Groundwater is fairly shallow here, so if you were to dig a hole in the ground, which, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of holes that have caps on it that we monitor water, is fairly shallow, meaning it's over, it varies from season. In the spring, the water table rises. In the this time of year, it's a little depressed. But it's around 3 to 6 feet below grade, fairly shallow. And as you move a little further away, the water, it gets a little bit deeper. So the cleanup options would be digging out the soil down to the water table, and then injecting remedial additives to biologically stimulate and clean up the residual contamination in the groundwater and also the soil. There's a variety of type of additives that are out there that are commonly used, that the state knows, that EPA is very familiar with, but it gets kind of expensive. It's injecting this chemical additive. The purpose of that chemical additive, it only works if it's in contact with the contamination. And then it has the bacteria in there that essentially kind of eat up the contamination, and it does destroy it. Since we want to clean up the groundwater, we would propose to inject this chemical additive all the way down to the bedrock, which is roughly 80 feet below the surface, and inject it as you retract the instrument that's used to inject this chemical additive all the way up to the surface. And you do this, there's a variety of ways to calculate this. The way we have it in here is every 15 feet, kind of on a grid spacing in this whole surface area. So that whole area of the soil column from the bedrock, from the rock surface up to the surface, would contain this chemical additive, so it would be in contact with the groundwater that's contaminated, so it would start cleaning it up. And the soil that is not directly removed, that I mentioned, the soil that's below the water table. Kind of think about digging up soil below water. If you're at the beach trying to dig in sand and it's all wet, it's almost a futile effort. So that's why the cleanup options for the direct soil removal are kind of stop at the water table. There are other cleanup options. You can dig below the water table if you kind of keep the water out of it. You can do sheet piling, where you kind of inject a steel wall all the way down and physically create a barrier so the water can't get in, so you can dig it out. That's very expensive, particularly in an area like this, where there's some close buildings nearby, that's bigger equipment's needed. We did not include that in here because we didn't think that was really practical. As you can see in the cleanup document here, and again, I'll just note publicly here that it is draft. It does say draft all over it, but it is a draft document. It's continually being worked on. The selected remedial alternative, which is digging up the soil within this orange box down to 6 feet and injecting the chemical additives is roughly $1 million. The other alternative, which is not selected, is digging up the soil within this larger area down to 6 feet, also injecting chemical additives, is around $2 million. There were other alternatives, as I mentioned, about the sheet pile and stuff that exceeded that, so we didn't include that because it's not really practical. There's a variety of metrics that EPA and the state require you to go through to evaluate cleanup options for any site. Is it effective? Is it reliable? Short-term and long-term reliability. Is it going to do what we want to do? Is it going to clean this up? Or is it going to clean this up a little bit and then kind of revert back later? Is it cost effective? What's the feasibility of doing this? You know, kind of as I mentioned, if it required a ton of heavy equipment, we're in a downtown area. It's not really feasible if you need a whole wide breadth to have these huge pieces of equipment here. It's just not feasible. So there's about 7 or 8 different categories to evaluate cleanup options and how effective it's going to be and practical if it's going to be. So the ones we have in the document is the ones that we felt would be kind of check the box the most of all those categories. And then there's a table in there that kind of has a matrix of each of the categories and how each one of those remedial alternatives score against those. I think that's it in a nutshell.
And
Maybe
you
more of a
also,
nutshell, but-
Tom, you also consider the surrounding land uses and any, you know, sensitive
Absolutely.
populations or buildings, and you're selecting the alternative based on what's, you know, what achieves the best benefit, but also is paying special attention to those
Exactly.
sensitive.
And that's first and foremost. I mean, the protective of human health is foremost in, you know, doing any cleanup and the environment. But we first look at protective of human health, particularly with, you know, releases of chlorinated solvents in urban environment. So yes, absolutely. So the cleanup alternatives was certainly the factors of where it is, where are the sensitive receptors. You know, this is, Chris mentioned, there's a church here, a library here, and you have residents with the nearby,
Post office.
the post office. What is going to achieve the best, you know, cleanup from a human health and environment perspective, and that's what's incorporated into the draft document here.
And then, could you talk a little bit about whether or not any of the cleanup options would require, or how they could work with, would require the removal of the existing building, or can we keep the existing building? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Both cleanup options are kind of independent of the building. It could either stay or it can be demolished. One thing I didn't mention, we did do a hazardous building material survey of the building that's still there. There is some asbestos in some of the building materials, so if the building is desired to be taken down, the asbestos would have to be abated from the building prior to demolition. Kind of similarly, if there's any major renovations that need to be done, which probably there would be, whoever does the renovations would have to be cognizant of where the asbestos is, and that would have to be abated before the renovations took place in the building. But to answer your question, the building doesn't have to be taken down for this remediation to occur. Like I said, it's independent.
And if remediation occurs, long-term, do all these sites continue to be monitored for the effectiveness of the remediation and whether or not they're still being impacted, groundwater, air quality?
Yes, the groundwater would have to be tested because it will take some time for the additive to treat the groundwater. Groundwater typically flows very slow. So it would take some time for the groundwater to start cleaning up. Now, this site the state has different resource areas considering where the pumping and drinking water wells are, and they have areas that are zoned where you have to clean up to the most stringent groundwater standards. This site happens to fall in the northern extreme portion of state's, they call it a Zone 2 area of a public supply well that's located roughly 1.25 miles away. So what that means is, in order to permanently close out the site from an environmental perspective, where nothing would need to be monitored ever again, groundwater would have to be cleaned up to that most stringent standard. That may not be feasible. If it is, it may take, it may take a considerable amount of time. So until it achieves a permanent closure where nothing else needs to be done, groundwater would need to be monitored to evaluate, hey, was the cleanup effective? Did it completely achieve what was desired, or did it partially achieve? Does something else need to be done, or is it okay? Along those same lines, indoor air testing. So where indoor air testing, it indicated that there was contaminants in the indoor air. We'd certainly want to retest those to evaluate whether the reduction and cleanup of soil and groundwater is indeed lowering concentrations in the indoor air and underneath the buildings. So, if there's contaminants that are underneath the building that may not be getting into indoor air now, we still need to address that, because the way indoor air can come into buildings, a variety of ways, but one of the maybe the easiest things to think of is if there's cracks in the floor of the basement. That's a way air can get into buildings. Of course, any penetrations into buildings, buildings around the site and the site itself are hooked up to city sewer and water. It's got to get into the building somehow, so there's pipe penetrations that come into most buildings. So you want to take a look at those. So getting back to the environmental question, yes, environmental monitoring would occur after the cleanup to demonstrate that yes, it was effective. Sorry if that was a long-winded answer. But.
So I guess just to wrap up kind of the presentation, if you will, our deadline to apply for the grant is Tuesday night, December 3rd, and we do intend to proceed. Again, as I mentioned, there are a lot of benefits to the community if the town is able to bring these EPA funds in to help clean this up. Tom mentioned the price tag of the preferred alternative is around $1 million. We're hopeful that goes down. We're working with EPA now on a separate track to see if they can remove some of the soil ahead of time, which would reduce the amount of money we would have to spend on the remediation. Maybe all we have to do is groundwater remediation. So we're working on that. Hopefully that $1 million price tag comes down by the time we get the grant. We're only allowed to apply for $500,000, and the cost is $1 million. So we will have to consider how to make up that difference, whether it's town funds or other grant funds. We will try to determine that. And at the end of the day, obviously the objective is to prepare this building for ultimately some sort of reuse that meets the needs of the community. So I guess, we're happy to take questions about, specifics or broad goals or whatever. I see Lee is jumping.
No, just a couple questions. So the remediation, so we're applying for $500,000 and we're thinking roughly $1 million, and then there's a gap there. So is this for the site in the back and not touching the structure that exists right now? Is this just to remediate okay, so the historic structure would still be intact by the time remediation is finished?
Yes,
okay.
the cleanup funds would be concentrated on the former building area. It would not include this standing building here.
Okay.
The proposed remediation does not include demolishing the existing building.
Gotcha, okay.
Yeah. Later, as Tom said, the indoor asbestos and things that are there would have to be dealt with.
Yeah, so that would be another grant possibly.
Right.
Okay. And so we're thinking if an RFP goes out and we sell it, once it's remediated, it's going to be worth a lot more, obviously. So we're thinking that this cost will be passed down to a developer that buys it because now they have a clean site, or what's the big vision, or do we not have that? And
You know, that's not worked out. Ideally, by putting it back on the tax rolls eventually, to the extent the town spends town money on that, we'll recoup that in the long run. In the ideal world, that's what would happen. Yeah.
And the money from EPA, as you probably know, the money from EPA is a grant.
There are others. There are other maybe cleanup sources. Mass Development has been involved in assessment here. Maybe
Yeah.
we could get a cleanup grant to supplement the EPA grant and any town funds. Berkshire Regional Planning Commission also has some grant funds. Those are through EPA
Yeah.
also, but they can be used in the Berkshire County region. So there may be a number of different grant sources that we can fill that gap.
so ideally, let's say, you know, we apply for 3 grants and it might take us 2 years to, you know, go for like the revolving loan fund or various things. Are we prepared to kind of just wait it out and hopefully get it paid for by other sources? Or are we kind of pushing to get it done sooner than later?
Well,
And
the
use
time,
some of
the
our-
timeline to, if we are successful in this, we may have an EPA grant in the fall of 2020. That's when this cycle when the funds might be available. And it would take some time to, you know, hopefully between now and then, we're getting other funds in line. Then it will take some time, if we have all the funds, to initiate the cleanup plans. So, you know, we would be looking into maybe sometime the calendar year 21 before cleanup activities would commence.
And there's no environmental liability insurance that like Ried Cleaners had that we could, you know, go back and see if they should be giving us money to clean this up, or I mean, do we kind of search back and make sure that they, you know, shouldn't have to remediate it more than they have, or something that we could?
We looked.
You've done, okay. There's no like, okay.
So you cart off the contaminated soil, you put in the product that starts to treat it, then you dump soil back on top?
Clean soil.
Clean soil.
Yes.
Could you then plant grass and put a playground there, or is there restricted use forever on what could go there?
For putting a playground there, that would
I'm
have.
just using that as an extreme.
Yeah,
example.
no, I mean, that's a good
Other
question.
limitations.
Yeah, probably additional precautions would have to be taken if it's going to be used for any type of recreational use. So that, I think the intent was that it was going to be kept commercial.
So,
If-
okay, so that's part of the decision, right? I guess that's
Yes.
my question. That decision needs to be made
Right,
before we choose plan, whatever this is.
right.
Okay.
Yes, and part of the plan, that's the, you know, the chosen plan of the smaller area of excavation of soil, would likely require a restriction on the property deed, stating that these are the allowable uses based on what's left in the ground, and these are not allowable.
Would, in this plan, would residential not be allowed above, say we wanted to have a mixed use with stores on the ground floor, residential above, would that?
It probably would be allowed, but you would have to take precautions to, you know, mitigate any potential vapors.
Right.
So, it's a little early in this stage to say, but if it's not required, it would be strongly recommended that any new building, should it be placed in that area, would have a vapor barrier down. Just as an extra level of assurance, you know, just so there isn't any question of any potential vapors coming in. Now, the point of remediating that, you know, that the source area with the soil and groundwater, hopefully would negate that. But in terms of new construction, you know, we've cleaned up sites where, from a health standpoint, a vapor barrier wasn't needed.
Sure.
But we recommend it just to have that extra level of assurance, and it's very inexpensive from a new construction standpoint.
The determination, or what kind of a deed restriction for uses going forward, when is that decided? Before we
It's
start?
working with the town, you know, kind of continually working with the town of what the, you know, desired end use would be for the property,
Right, so-
and the
okay.
level of cleanup that's required. Did that answer your question, or?
It's not, because we're applying for this grant with a certain kind of remediation,
Mhm,
and this kind of remediation will limit what's allowed there.
correct.
Do we already know what that limit is, I guess is the question.
The limit, it would allow commercial use, it would allow any type of commercial use. and it may allow some type of multifamily residential use. It would almost not, definitively would not allow single-family residential use, and it likely probably would not allow any type of recreation use, like that hypothetical scenario you mentioned about playground.
When will you know that for sure? After it's all done, you take a reading? Or-
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes. Because, the plan is to do X, Y, and Z.
right.
And then, as Chris mentioned, is there environmental monitoring? Yes, because we want to demonstrate, well, how effective was it? What, did it go according to plan, or was there some, there's mingled contamination, as you kind of alluded, there's both petroleum and soil. The chlorinated solvents is by and large a driver of the cleanup at this site. But there is petroleum contamination. It's largely kind of restricted to soil, and petroleum contamination usually, it doesn't really move that far as in terms of related between chlorinated solvent contamination and petroleum. And that's confirmed at this site too. The petroleum contamination does not extend over in this area here. These wells here were installed to delineate the extent of the chlorinated solvents, not for petroleum, because they weren't found closer to that.
And is there any reason not to divide the property in half, start using the building right away? And
No, I mean,
would that be
it's-
safe to do?
Um,
I'm not saying you.
Well, I think I may have mentioned before, the indoor air in this building was only tested once back in roughly 2010. So the indoor air in this building, there is chlorinated solvents in the indoor air. Why it hasn't been tested again is because it's vacant. There's no one occupying it. So the exposure to people, it is non-existent at this point. We understand the future use is going to either use this existing structure or potentially demolish it and put a new building in. And at that time, need to evaluate, all right, what needs to be done in order for that to be used. One of it would be put a vapor barrier in. But more assessment could potentially be needed in the building footprint here, depending upon the exact type of reuse. Is this building gonna be reused? Or is it gonna be taken down? Or is this area gonna be used for park? There's a lot of different scenarios, obviously.
But all that can happen concurrent or even right away, even before you redid the rest of it?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Yeah, because most of the contamination is here. And so our feeling is this needs to be addressed, because if this isn't addressed, it potentially could keep contaminating, soil doesn't move. It could keep contaminating the water. So it really makes sense to clean up what's causing the problem first. Yes?
Any thought been given to whether, sort of the area of concern could be, farther out from just those residences on Rossiter, the post office, the library? Is there any concern that the flow of groundwater has gone, maybe into other residential areas? I'm just curious if.
Sure.
'Cause
So
I've seen a chart where it looks like.
it's hard to see here. There's a blue arrow here. This blue arrow is denoting the approximate direction of groundwater flow based on the wells that have been installed. It's generally flowing to the southeast. Not surprising, because the Housatonic's over to the east, as you are well aware. So why some of these wells are kind of placed where they are, as Chris mentioned, when we were working under a mass development grant, we had installed, one of the wells we had installed was this one here. When we had sampled this, it came just above the state's threshold, meaning that it wasn't quite we didn't quite find the edge of the groundwater contamination. So under the town's current grant, we installed this one here next to the public library. This one is below the state standards. And it actually turns out this one is below too. It's not uncommon for concentrations in groundwater to fluctuate based on the seasons. And concentrations in groundwater, we're talking parts per billion, kind of small, absolute values of contaminants. So if it varies a couple parts per billion, that doesn't seem like a lot, but it could make a big difference from the state if it's straddling the groundwater cleanup criteria. And that's what happened with this one. Don't quote me on this number, but I think the state's cleanup criteria for PCE and groundwater is 5 parts per billion, and this one came up at 5 point something. But now it's not detect. at one.
So when you have a source like that, is it unpredictable, or can you sort of, just based on your experience, or, or the readings from those wells, tell whether, it could change and shift and maybe grow more potent as it travels, or does it just, does it continue to dilute, or?
The further away you get from the source, it generally gets less. It does generally dilute. Based on experience and based on the behavior of the contaminants, we can predict where, what, areas would be a concern and what haven't, based on all the information that we have. But it is a complex problem. It's a complex problem because of the type of contaminant, and also because it's commingled with a fuel oil release also. Now all the groundwater wells, except for one, are monitoring the groundwater quality, the shallow groundwater quality in the soil, or if you read some documents, it's called overburden, basically dirt. It's groundwater that's in the soil. That's where we're talking about here, where I mentioned before, that's roughly 3 to 6 feet below grade. But because because chlorinated solvents are, a little more, they behave differently, they sink in the environment. We want to see how far down the groundwater is contaminated. And that's where it gets complicated. So there's one well that we installed, denoted by this red symbol here, just because it stood out so we could show folks. We just installed that this past year, and we installed that one within the top of rock. As I mentioned before, top of rock here is roughly 80 feet below grade. That well is installed to 98 feet down, so it's roughly 18 feet into rock. The groundwater from that, and it's only screened in that bottom section, so the whole top part, there's this 4-inch steel casing that's cemented into the ground, so none of the water from the soil can get down into the rock from that well. So the water that we're sampling from that well only is coming from the shallow rock. That is above the state's standards, so more work would be needed to delineate the extent of groundwater contamination in bedrock. So from your question of, can you predict, are there other areas? Now the groundwater contamination in rock is much less, orders of magnitude, than it is in the shallower groundwater. And again, treating the water all the way down to the bedrock surface in the area, including where this bedrock well is, would help fix that problem, for lack of a better word.
There are wells south of the site on the post office property and Masonic Temple property. There are wells west of the site of the source area. There are wells north and east. Generally, as Tom said, the groundwater flow is to the east and southeast, and there's really been no detect to the west or south. There was a strange detect north.
This one here.
I don't know which seems strange because groundwater's not going that way.
How about the Masonic Temple?
That one was clean. That
Oh.
one wasn't detected.
Yeah.
This one here, yeah.
So we have a good sense of where the shallow groundwater impacts are, and to the extent bedrock is impacted, we know how deep that
Did you
is.
say that was a 98-foot, that goes 98 feet down?
That one well does,
That one
yes.
does, okay.
Yes. Most of the other wells on the property roughly are about 15 or 20 feet deep. Yes.
I have a question, it might be for town. Have we ever done an appraisal of the site before remediation and demolition versus if it was a complete, clean site, clear? Because that might, inform us in terms of how we want to develop it. If there's kind of a, appraisal as is now versus cleaned up and, let's say demolished or cleaned up with the structure on there. Because I think that would be interesting to inform us what to do next.
We haven't. We haven't done that kind of appraisal. Generally, we know that sites and buildings on Main Street are desirable in the marketplace. And this one starts with at least negative $1 million price tag. So,
No, exactly.
So
I
I
think
think
it might be
we
interesting.
don't have the scientific appraisal, but
Yeah.
we know the parameters are
Is-
definitely impacting, that negative
It just might be
sign
interesting
here is
to
definitely
know.
impacting the viability of.
Yeah,
of
I mean,
food
I would
development.
be, if maybe the select board, if, we could, because I think, knowing that, how much it was appraised for as is versus cleaned up and, demolished, how much it would be worth to the town, because I think that would really inform us a lot what to do moving forward, so I might ask that in the next meeting, or ask people here. I don't know really how to do that, but I just think that might be interesting.
What's the total excavation area like with what you would be taking out? So depth was 6 feet, right? And
The
then,
depth of 6 feet, yeah, it's roughly 40 feet by 20 feet.
okay. And has anybody done any analysis on the asbestos problem? Any sense of what that would cost, how much it is? How
Oh,
much
we
it's-
did, not really an we did an analysis to see whether it's there or not and where it is in the building.
Okay.
But we had not evaluated what it would cost to abate it.
Okay.
Based on, I think
It
Tom.
would be a
Cur-
much lower price tag than this, though.
Yeah, Tom,
by
correct me if
far.
I'm wrong, but from that
Yes.
study, we know generally what types of asbestos-containing materials are in the building, and I think we can make some assumptions of how widespread they are in the building.
Right.
And come up with quantities, so it's not too difficult to come up with some ballpark of that cleanup, cost.
And the biggest
Remediation.
expense is disposing of the asbestos, right?
Of course,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. There was a question in the back. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Tom, it's Tim Geller. It's been a while.
I thought I recognized.
Yeah, good to see you.
Do you have any experience with chlorinated solvents?
But I was told once by a legal team for someone who was looking at buying the building, that the building foundation was saturated with the solvents as well. Is that
I
not
haven't heard of
possible?
that. I'm not saying it's true or not. I don't recall that. I don't recall reading that in any of the historical reports. So I'm not sure if that was something you heard from someone, or I don't know.
I heard it from an attorney who was representing someone looking at buying it.
Oh, okay.
Um,
I'm not aware of that.
yeah.
No.
But it could, right? I mean, if it can get into, obviously if we can get into bedroom.
Well, the groundwater, I don't recall off the top of my head, but I believe the groundwater in this well near it is above state standards, and the water's in contact with the foundation, so you can, it depends what, the foundation saturated what solvents means. Is the foundation in contact with contaminated groundwater? Likely. Whether the concrete, the foundation itself is saturated with contaminants, I don't think that's ever been assessed. Like, I don't think pieces of the foundation have ever been tested.
I think it would, I would be very surprised if the building could be saved, I guess that's all I'm saying. I think the most likely scenario is for everything to go. But you're doing a full, phase 2, is that what you're doing?
That's the intent to the extent possible. What we had submitted to the state back in 2015 was called an interim Phase 2 comprehensive site assessment. It's called interim just so it complies with the state standards, because in order to complete a state Phase 2 according with the state regulations in Massachusetts contingency plan, you have to fully delineate the extent of contamination. Back in 2015, as I mentioned, we hadn't fully delineated the extent of contamination. It's still not fully delineated. It's delineated from a lateral standpoint. We know now how far you can put your kind of arms around the area of contaminated groundwater now. But there's still the potential, there's still the question of how deep it goes. But again, the preferred cleanup alternative would also address the contamination in the rock.
So obviously, we would be protected from liability, any liability, if we cleaned it up and then sold it to a private developer and they built housing and then.
Yes, the
something
town
happened.
mentioned, the town's not considered a liable party, because they took the property through back taxes.
Even though that we're gonna be cleaning it up though, so.
Yeah, so there's a variety of things you have to do to maintain your exempt status with the state. And one of them, as Chris, I think you mentioned, is not using the site right now. And also, should there be something that's considered, an urgent concern that the state would take, that the town, would take care of it. But the town is not considered a liable party.
Even though we're remediating it.
Correct.
Right. Now, if you were to remediate it and then use the property, then you would be.
You mean if the town holds onto it?
What's that?
When you say use it, you mean.
And I'm not an attorney, so I mean, that would, legal counsel would have to be,
So if the town wanted to use it for ourselves, or, we wanted to create.
At this point, it would not be advisable for the town to, park its trucks there or allow the public to park there generally, use it as a public parking lot or for town, staff parking or anything. That would be considered using the property, and
But after remediation, then.
if we remediate it in accordance with the state, the MCP, the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, which are their brownfield standards, and we achieve some sort of cleanup, temporary closure, temporary solution, in accordance with that, then we'd be protected to a certain extent. And so would a future user or purchaser of that site. And as was previously mentioned, if there were any use limitations, those would be recorded on the deed so that anybody in the future would know what can and can't be done, or, did you still have a question?
Yeah, I did. I was curious, you said calls on the property. I was curious if anybody mentioned what they were interested in utilizing it for or had an interest in.
It varies, it's I've been here with the town about 10 years, and, there've been calls in every one of those 10 years about, I'm interested in this building, and
They don't say what they're interested in it for, though?
not necessarily, yeah. They obviously know it's a downtown area. A lot of people ask, what are the allowable uses in this zone, which is commercial or business uses and mixed uses like commercial and residential. So those sorts of questions get asked, but nobody says, I want to do X.
Got it.
Tom, just
Yeah.
another question about liability.
Yeah.
If you, if a private party purchases the property, they would also purchase the liability of the ongoing testing and the potential for further cleaning up if it happens in the future that there are ways determined that they need to be cleaned up, right?
Correct.
I mean, the way we got around this on the Lacombe site was simply to ground lease the dirt, so that the liability stays with the CDC.
Right.
That would be another option.
Yeah,
I
and
think.
sometimes, so a ground lease is an option. Sometimes parties will purchase a site once the extent of contamination is known and the extent of remediation that is required is known. And if they follow the cleanup plan that's required, the state will sometimes grant a covenant not to sue,
Exactly. That's what I mentioned.
where that new party wouldn't be held liable for previous party's contamination, so long as the new party was trying to clean it up. If there was new contamination, they'd be responsible for it. But a covenant not to sue is sometimes granted. That's through the state.
I'm not quite sure if that covenant not to sue works that way, but we could talk about it, because we have one
Okay.
on the Lacombe site. But, I think the risk, I think, in this case would be, I mean, you're not gonna get the S1 standards in the groundwater, right? That's clear.
The GW1 standards.
Yeah. So-
Probably, again, that's a very difficult, that's the highest bar the
I know,
state
and it's
has
the
for
highest
groundwater.
bar, right, so subsequently, you won't get to a permanent solution.
If you did, it wouldn't be not be in the short term. So I think how we have written it, it's probably not likely.
Right,
So probably the most likely scenario would be achieving a temporary solution
right.
with the state.
We love those, temporary solutions forever.
Yeah.
But that would be the liability for someone else, is that, 50 years from now, someone figures out a process to actually
Mhm.
get it to that high standard, that the party who owns it would be responsible for doing it.
Right.
You carry that responsibility with you.
Right, I see yeah, there's a distinction there, yeah.
Hey, this is a piece of cake, guys.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks, everybody, and cross your fingers and wish us luck.
Really glad you're moving forward on it.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.